Hey, thank you for showing up. It means more than you know. The rain had been falling since dawn, soft but steady, painting the wooden porch in a dull silver sheen. My house sat close to the Willamette River, far enough to feel the quiet, but near enough to hear the current when the wind blew from the south. I had lived here alone for 5 years since Edward passed. Every sound seemed sharper when you lived alone, even the whisper of paper sliding through the mail slot. That morning the sound came again. I walked to the front door and picked up a single white envelope, thick, expensive, the kind used for weddings. The ink shimmered faintly gold pressed against ivory. My heart gave a small, foolish leap before I even opened it. For a moment I thought maybe Ryan had finally called, maybe this was his way of telling me he wanted me there. I slid my thumb under the seal and unfolded the card. To the family of the late Edward Carver. I stared at it. The line felt cold, mechanical, written by a stranger. No mom, no Linda, just that title as if I only existed through a dead man's shadow. I read it again, slower, hoping I'd missed something, but no. My name was nowhere. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one Edward built himself back in 1998, and ran my hand over the grain of the wood. The kettle whistled softly behind me, and I poured myself a cup of tea just to have something to do with my hands. They were getting married next month. The venue printed on the invitation was a vineyard outside Eugene. I remembered that Ryan loved vineyards, said he liked how the air smelled after harvest. I also remembered that I had helped him with the down payment for his house, the car loan, and part of his tuition. $78,000 in 4 years. I didn't regret a cent of it. What hurt wasn't the money. It was that line on the envelope, the way it erased me. I dialed Ryan's number before I could talk myself out of it. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Hi, Linda, it's Sabrina." Her tone was polite, sweet, in a practiced way. I could hear Ryan in the background saying something I couldn't make out. "Sabrina, I said I got your invitation. There seems to be a mistake." A pause, short but heavy. "Oh," she said finally. "No mistake, actually. We're keeping it small, just close family." I felt the tea cooling between my palms. "I am close family," I said quietly. There was a sound like a sigh or a laugh, I couldn't tell which. "Of course," Sabrina said. "It's just that things get complicated. We want it intimate. Can I speak to Ryan?" "He's right here," she said. Then silence. I waited. I heard nothing but a faint click as the line went dead. I stared at the phone until the screen dimmed. Outside, the rain had turned heavier, thick drops streaking down the window pane. I put the phone on the table and picked up the invitation again. The gold letters blurred slightly where a drop of water landed. I wasn't sure if it was from the rain or from me. By afternoon, the ache in my chest had turned into a quiet numbness. I opened my laptop more from habit than purpose. My email inbox was full of newsletters and retirement plan notices, nothing from Ryan. But when I clicked on social media, his face appeared at the top of the feed. A photo. Sabrina in a white dress, not a wedding gown, but close enough standing between her smiling parents under a string of fairy lights. Ryan had his arm around her, looking lighter than I had seen him in years. The caption read, "Finally surrounded by real family." For a second I thought I had read it wrong, then I felt the slow heat crawl up my throat. The comment section was full of hearts and congratulations, her friends, her colleagues. Not one person mentioned me, not even Ryan. I scrolled until my finger trembled. There it was again, real family. Edward used to say that family wasn't something you earned, it was something you honored. I whispered the words out loud, but they sounded old-worn, like they belonged to another time. I went to the kitchen, poured another cup of tea, and tried to steady my breathing. The cup slipped from my hand as I reached for the sugar jar. It hit the tiled floor, cracked, and spilled amber tea across the white surface. The sound was small but final, like something breaking far beyond the room. I knelt down, picking up the pieces carefully, watching how the crack ran like a vein through porcelain. Outside, the rain softened again. Through the window, I could see the lavender bushes bending slightly under the weight of the water, their color fading in the dim light. For a moment, I thought of Edward standing there years ago, trimming those same bushes while Ryan chased the dog down the yard. That memory was still bright, untouched, but the present felt like a closed door. I cleaned the floor slowly, one piece at a time. My hands shook not from age, but from the effort of holding back everything I wanted to say. When the last shard was gone, I rinsed the towel, hung it neatly, and stood still. The house was quiet again, except for the sound of the rain. I went to the living room, sat down near the window, and stared out toward the river. The water moved steady and unbothered, like it didn't care who was named or forgotten. People think betrayal comes in loud moments, I thought. Shouting, slamming doors, broken promises. But sometimes it comes in a sentence printed in gold ink. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight settle. You don't need to be screamed at to be erased. Sometimes all it takes is for someone to stop calling your name. Outside, the sky dimmed into gray, and I stayed there in the silence, listening to the rain and the quiet ticking of the old kitchen clock, wondering when exactly I had stopped being invited into my own family. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, heavy like a bruise over the city. I made coffee and sat by the window with my old ledger, the one Edward gave me on our 20th anniversary. He used to joke that I was the only woman who found comfort in numbers. Maybe he was right. Numbers didn't lie, didn't gossip, didn't promise things they couldn't keep. I turned the brittle pages, my handwriting steady and neat even after all these years. Each line carried a piece of my life carefully recorded. I began tracing through the years. 1, tuition for Ryan's MBA at the University of Oregon, $25,000. I remembered wiring the money to his student account and him calling afterward, his voice full of gratitude. He said, "Mom, one day I'll make you proud." 2, 3, $8,500, the repair after he totaled his car on I-5. I had sent the check overnight, afraid he might lose his job if he couldn't get to work. 4, 5, $20,000. Down payment for the townhouse he and Sabrina wanted. He said it was temporary, just until they got the loan approved. I signed the transfer the next morning. 6-7, $24,500, wedding expenses, venue deposit, catering balance, Sabrina's request for floral upgrades. I had told myself it was a gift. 8, $78,000 in total. I wrote the number in the margin, then drew a single line beneath it. For years, that ledger had been the story of my love disguised as accounting. Now it was just evidence of how far I had gone to buy the illusion of belonging. I sat back and rubbed my temples. The room smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. My phone buzzed on the counter. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but the sound pierced the silence again. A message appeared on the screen. "Mom, we just need $15,000 more to close on the house. It's the last bit. Promise." The words felt rehearsed, like something copied from a script. There was no greeting, no thank you, just the familiar tug of obligation. I stared at the message until the letters blurred. 15,000. I thought of my savings, my fixed income, the rising property taxes. I thought of the invitation that didn't bear my name. I typed slowly. I'm not a bank. Then I erased it. My finger hovered above the keyboard. I tried again. Take care of yourselves. I pressed send. I knew what would come next. Within minutes, another message appeared. We'll pay you back soon. Please don't make this difficult. I felt something tighten in my chest. Difficult. That word landed harder than any insult. Difficult was what people called you when they couldn't control you anymore. I placed the phone face down on the table and stared at the window. The morning light filtered through gray clouds, turning everything pale. I reached for the ledger again, tracing the ink of the last entry. My pen slipped a little as I wrote a note in the margin. No more withdrawals. My phone buzzed again, vibrating across the counter, stubborn like a mosquito. I ignored it. Then came another and another. I picked it up and saw 3 missed calls from Ryan. When I finally answered, the line was already hot with tension. "Mom, he said you didn't respond to Sabrina's message. We're in a tight spot." I heard her voice faintly in the background, sharp, irritated. She said something I couldn't make out. "Ryan, I said I've helped you for years. Maybe it's time you learned how to help yourself. It's just temporary," he said. "We'll pay you back as soon as we sell the condo. You said that last time." He exhaled hard. "Why are you being like this? Sabrina thinks you're upset about the invitation." I paused. The invitation, that was almost funny. "Ryan, you're getting married. You should start living like a man who can stand on his own." The silence that followed was long and brittle. Then he said, "Fine. Forget it." The call ended with a click that echoed in the quiet kitchen. I stared at the phone, my hand still trembling slightly. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink. The sound of it swirling away felt strangely final. I walked back to the table, opened the drawer, and pulled out a small box of old receipts. I flipped through them: car payments, tuition deposits, the transfer for the house, every piece of proof that I had been there when they needed me. I stacked them neatly, then closed the box. The air felt colder now. I went to the thermostat and turned it up a notch, but the chill stayed. Maybe it wasn't the air. Maybe it was something settling inside me, something that had been waiting to stop pretending. I picked up my phone again. The screen still showed Ryan's last text. "We'll pay you back soon. Please don't make this difficult." I opened the settings, scrolled to contacts, and hovered over his name. My thumb hesitated for a second. Blocking your own child was something no mother ever planned for. But motherhood wasn't meant to be a lifetime subscription either. The sound was small, almost delicate when I pressed the button. A single click. The house went completely still after that. No buzzing phone, no expectation, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of the river wind outside. I sat down again, closing the ledger, feeling the weight of it in my lap. The leather cover was cracked at the corners, soft from years of handling. Edward's handwriting was still on the inside cover, for Linda, the woman who keeps us balanced. I smiled faintly, not from happiness, but from recognition. He had always understood what numbers meant to me. They never lied, never begged, never disappeared. The clock ticked again, steady as a heartbeat. I placed the ledger on the shelf and turned off the kitchen light. The reflection in the window showed a woman I barely recognized, tired but strangely calm. Freedom didn't come in grand gestures or declarations. It came in the quiet after a single decision. Sometimes it was as small as not sending another text. Sometimes it was the peace that followed one clean, undeniable click. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, and a thin ray of light slipped through, landing across the table where the ledger lay closed. I watched it until it faded, then walked to the window and drew the curtains, letting the house settle into silence once more. The morning light came in pale through the curtains, thin and colorless, like it hadn't made up its mind about shining. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing my cup, letting the water run longer than it needed to. The silence in the house had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore, just steady, like a breath held for too long that had finally been released. By mid-morning, I decided it was time to close what should have been closed long ago. I put on my gray coat, grabbed my umbrella, and drove toward downtown Portland. The streets were slick with rain from the night before, the kind that darkened the asphalt but left the air cool and clean. I parked across from the Riverbend Credit Union, the place where I had spent 25 years of my life balancing other people's mistakes. Inside, everything looked smaller. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. A young teller greeted me, and when I mentioned my name, her eyes lit up. She must have seen it in the old employee files. Then Anthony Ruiz appeared from his office, still tall, still wearing the same kind of navy tie he had worn back when I trained him as an intern. "Linda Carver," he said, his smile spreading wide. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it. "How long has it been? Almost 5 years since I retired." He chuckled softly. "Time flies." "What brings you back here, business?" I said. The kind of business I should have handled sooner. He led me into his office. The walls were covered with photos of his kids and framed certificates. Everything smelled faintly of new carpet and lemon cleaner. I sat down and placed my purse on my lap. "I need to make some changes to my accounts," I said. "I want to close the joint account with my son and remove all linked access from his profile. Also, I'd like to add a fraud alert and designate a secondary monitor." He blinked, then nodded, professional but hesitant. "Of course we can do that. I just need to confirm Ryan Carver correct. That's right." He typed for a moment, the clack of keys sharp in the quiet room. He glanced up at me. "Is everything all right? Everything's fine. I'm just cleaning up old files." He smiled gently. "You were always the neat one with numbers, but closing family accounts isn't something we see every day." "Blood doesn't guarantee responsibility," I said evenly. "I've learned that the hard way." He nodded without pressing further and printed out a set of forms. The pages slid across the desk with the faint hiss of paper on wood. I read each line carefully, the old habit returning like muscle memory. No more shared access, no automatic transfers, no beneficiary ties except the primary retirement fund. I initialed every clause slow and steady. When it came time to name a new monitor, Anthony asked if I had anyone in mind. "Yes, Elaine Foster. She lives next door." "Retired attorney, 65, meticulous and trustworthy." He smiled again. "Sounds like a good choice. We'll just need her signature within a week." I took the pen he offered, my hand steady, and signed at the bottom of each page. My name looked cleaner than I expected, like it belonged to someone who had finally stopped apologizing. As I handed the forms back, my phone vibrated in my purse. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Anthony raised an eyebrow. Busy morning, persistent morning. He handed me the final receipt. All set, Linda. The accounts are updated, and I'll personally make sure everything processes today. Thank you, Anthony. You always ran a tight ship, he chuckled. Learn from the best. I stood up, smoothing my coat. As I walked toward the exit, the phone buzzed again. I pulled it out. 3 missed calls from Ryan, 1 new message from Sabrina. What are you doing, Mom? No question mark, no warmth, just accusation, plain and sharp. I stared at the screen for a moment before turning the phone face down. Outside, the rain had started again, light but steady. I stepped out under the awning, watching people rush by with their umbrellas, everyone moving in different directions, heads down, eyes on their own reflections in puddles. I stood there for a while, breathing in the damp air, remembering how many times I had waited for someone else's approval before doing what was right for me. The door behind me clicked shut. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass, small against the gray sky, but upright. When Edward was alive, he used to tell me that life was just a series of ledgers balancing what you give and what you keep. Maybe I had given too much for too long. Maybe now it was time to even the page. I walked back to the car, the wet pavement reflecting the faint shimmer of traffic lights. My phone vibrated again, this time with a call. I let it ring. Then another came. I turned off the ringer. The drive home was quiet, the wipers moving rhythmically against the windshield. When I reached the Riverbend neighborhood, the rain had thinned to a mist. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a while. Through the window, I could see the lavender bushes bending in the wind. The same bushes that Edward planted before his last summer. I got out, locked the car, and walked up to the porch. Inside the house felt warmer than before. I hung my coat, placed my purse on the counter, and set my phone down. I poured myself a small glass of water, feeling the dryness in my throat fade. The phone lit up again, silent this time. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I watched it until the call ended, the display fading back to black. Then I opened the window above the sink, letting the cool air in. The rain smelled faintly of soil and cedar. It reminded me that not everything needed to grow back the same way it had been planted. Sometimes you close one file, not because it's empty, but because you're done accounting for the pain inside it. I stood there looking out at the gray ribbon of sky above the trees and felt something inside settle into place like a scale finding balance. In the reflection of the window pane, I saw my own outline, small, quiet, but straight as a ruled line. I held my gaze there until the light shifted and my image disappeared into the gray beyond. Saturday afternoons were usually quiet in my house. I liked it that way. I had just brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the smell of roasted beans warming the kitchen, when I heard a car door slam outside. The sound was sharp, impatient. Before I could reach the window, the front door swung open without knocking. Ryan stepped in, first shoulders tense, followed by Sabrina, her lips pressed into a tight smile, and a man I didn't recognize carrying a leather briefcase. He looked mid-30s, polished, the kind of confidence that comes from rehearsed charm. "Linda," he said, smoothly extending his hand. "I'm Dylan Moore. I work in financial planning with Sabrina's firm. I'm family too, I suppose." I didn't take his hand. My fingers stayed wrapped around the coffee mug. "What brings you all here unannounced?" Ryan glanced at Sabrina. She nodded at Dylan, who opened the briefcase and took out a stack of papers. "Just something simple," he said, sliding them onto the counter. "A power of attorney form. It's just to protect you in case there's ever a financial mix-up. Sabrina thought it'd be safer if someone helped you manage the accounts." The air in the room thickened. I stared at the top page and saw the words printed clearly, "Durable power of attorney." My name filled in neatly in blue ink, the kind that smudges when someone signs too fast. Sabrina leaned against the counter, smiling like a realtor closing a deal. "You've always been so organized," she said sweetly. "This way we can take some pressure off you. It's really just about safety." Ryan avoided my eyes. He stood near the sink, fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. I studied his face and saw the same boy who once asked me how to fill out his first bank slip. I took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down. My voice came out even. "So you're saying I'm incapable of managing my own finances?" "No, Mom," Ryan said quickly. "That's not what we mean. It's just, it'd be easier for everyone." "Easier for who exactly?" Sabrina's smile flickered. "It's a family thing," she said. "People your age sometimes get targeted by scams. We're just trying to make sure everything's secure." I walked to the counter, picked up the paper, and read every line. I had written enough financial contracts in my life to know this wasn't just protection. It was access, full control. Dylan started speaking again, his tone rehearsed. It's very standard, Linda. Nothing changes in your daily routine. You'd still handle what you like, but this gives your family the authority to act if something happens. I looked him straight in the eye. If something happens, I already have a will and an estate plan. What you're asking for is power without oversight. He smiled thinly. You're sharp. That's good, but it really is for peace of mind. I reached for my phone on the counter, tapped the record button, and placed it face up next to the paper. His eyes darted toward it, then back to me. I said quietly, I used to audit hospitals and construction companies for a living. I can read numbers faster than most people can read lies. Ryan looked up, then his face pale. Mom, please. We're just trying to help. Sabrina's voice rose, slightly irritation slipping through the sweetness. You don't have to make this difficult. We're thinking about your future. My future has already been written, I said. What you're thinking about is convenience. Dylan reached forward to gather the papers, but I placed my hand over them first. He hesitated. Let me be very clear, I said, my voice calm but firm. Anyone who tries to pressure an elderly person into signing a power of attorney for personal access is committing fraud. If I ever see this again, you'll be talking to the police instead of me. Sabrina's face went red. Her jaw tightened. She grabbed her purse from the counter. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Ryan, are you really going to let her talk to us like this? Ryan said nothing. He stood there staring at the floor. Fine, she hissed. Let's go. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the picture frame on the wall rattled. Dylan followed quickly, muttering something under his breath. Ryan lingered for a moment, caught between shame and anger. I turned to him. You knew about this? He rubbed the back of his neck. Sabrina said it was just paperwork, that it'd help us manage things better. I didn't think. That's right, I said. You didn't think. He winced. Mom, I didn't mean to. I cut him off gently. You're an adult, Ryan. Start living like one. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. After a moment, he left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, but I still heard the faint sound of the car engine outside. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing slowly. My pulse was steady. I picked up the papers from the counter and tore them in half, then again, until the pieces were small enough to fit in my palm. I dropped them in the trash and pressed down until they disappeared beneath the coffee grounds. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the refrigerator. I walked to the door and turned the lock. The metal clicked, cleanly final. For a long while, I just stood there, hand resting on the knob, listening to the rain start again outside. It hit the roof in even rhythm, like a metronome, reminding me that time still moved forward no matter who tried to take control of it. I went back to the counter and poured myself another cup of coffee. The steam curled upward, catching the light from the kitchen window. I lifted it slowly, took a sip, and let the warmth spread through me. There was no anger left, just clarity. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, but silence could be sharp too. I glanced at the closed door, its frame still trembling slightly from the earlier slam. The air felt clean again, stripped of noise and performance. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly over the river. I set down my cup and watched the ripples of rain against the glass. I didn't need anyone to guard my money. What I needed was to protect the one thing they could never buy back for me, my dignity. The rain cleared overnight, leaving the yard soaked and glistening under a pale morning sun. I stepped outside barefoot, the boards of the porch cool against my skin. The air smelled of wet cedar and earth, heavy with that sweet ache that follows a storm. I carried the small pair of garden shears Edward had given me years ago, the metal handle worn smooth where his hand used to fit. The rose bushes waited near the fence, wild from neglect. He planted them in 2018, said they would keep the yard alive through any season. The petals had gone brown at the edges, clinging stubbornly to stems that needed cutting. I crouched down and touched one of the thorns, pricking lightly against my thumb. I whispered to the quiet yard, "You had your time." The first cut was clean, a sharp snap that broke the silence. Then another and another, until the ground was scattered with fading red petals. I moved slowly, trimming each branch down to where new growth could find its place. By the time I was done, the bush looked bare, almost vulnerable. A voice came from the sidewalk. "You're braver than me, Linda." I turned to see Elaine Foster, my neighbor, holding her morning paper under one arm. She wore her usual gray sweater and that calm look of someone who had already lived through too much to be surprised by anything. "Good morning," I said, catching my breath. She leaned on the fence eyes on the roses. "I can't believe you're cutting those." "Edward loved them." I nodded. "I know. He planted them for me. But they've been blooming for a man who isn't here anymore. I want them to bloom for the woman who still is." Elaine smiled, faint but genuine. "That's something she said." I gathered the wilted branches into a pile. The air was warmer now, the kind of warmth that sticks to your neck. Elaine came closer and took one of the stems from the ground, turning it between her fingers. "You ever hear of the Evergreen Circle?" she asked. "No, what's that?" "It's a group I've been part of for a few years. Women like us, retired, widowed, or just tired of being taken advantage of. We meet every other Thursday at the community center. We talk about finances, scams, legal stuff, things no one bothers to teach women our age until it's too late." I looked at her, the rose stems still in my hands. "Sounds practical. It's more than practical," she said. "It's survival. Last year, a friend of mine almost lost her savings to a fake caregiver. Another woman's son opened a credit card in her name. We've all been through something. You'd fit right in." I hesitated, staring at the pile of cut roses. I had always prided myself on knowing better, on keeping order in chaos. Yet somehow I had still found myself standing in the wreckage of trust. "I don't know if I'm the group type," I said softly. Elaine chuckled. "None of us are at first. We start with coffee and stories, the rest follows." She pulled a small card from her sweater pocket and handed it to me. "Evergreen Circle Foundation, Portland Community Center, next meeting, Tuesday at 6. The edges of the card were bent like it had already passed through several hands before finding mine. I turned it over, reading the motto printed at the bottom. "Protect what you've built, learn what you deserve." I liked the sound of that. Elaine pointed at the rose bush. "You're doing it right, you know. Pruning looks harsh, but it's the only way they grow back strong." I smiled, tired but lighter somehow. "Maybe that's true for people too." She patted my arm. "See you Tuesday then?" I looked down at the pile of old blooms, their red fading to rust. "Yeah, maybe you will." She walked off toward her driveway, humming softly to herself. I watched her go, then gathered the cut stems into a bundle. They were heavier than I expected. I carried them to the trash bin by the side of the house and dropped them in. The sound they made was dull, final. A few petals escaped, caught by a soft wind that carried them upward, spinning in the sunlight before settling on the grass. Inside the house smelled faintly of coffee and soil. I washed my hands at the sink, the water running pink from tiny scratches on my fingers. I looked out the window at the bare bush, its stems clean and sharp, already touched by the sun. For a moment I thought of Edward again. He used to tell me that roses were like people, they needed both care and boundaries. I whispered, "You were right, Ed." Then I wiped my hands on the towel and turned off the faucet. The quiet didn't feel lonely this time. It felt like space-wide and possible. I took the card from my pocket and placed it on the table beside my coffee mug. The letters shimmered faintly in the light Evergreen Circle Foundation. I stood there a while, looking at the roses outside, at the thin stems swaying gently in the morning air. They looked stripped down, almost fragile, but I knew they would bloom again, maybe brighter than before. There are things you have to cut, I thought, not because they're dead, but because they've grown in the wrong direction. I opened the window to let the breeze in. The sunlight fell across the floor, catching the bits of dust that danced like gold in the air. Sometimes you have to prune the past to make room for the present. Sometimes you start over with nothing but faith that something new will take root. I watched the petals outside the wind carrying them beyond the fence, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to see what would grow next. The community center smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee when I walked in that afternoon. The sky outside was still bright, the kind of late summer light that made everything feel washed and exposed. I followed the sound of voices down the hall to a meeting room filled with folding chairs and women my age, some talking quietly, some just watching. A banner hung at the front of the room with green letters that read, "Evergreen Circle Foundation." Elaine waved me over from the second row. "You made it," she whispered, patting the seat next to her. I smiled and sat down. A few minutes later, the room quieted as a woman in a navy blazer stepped up to the small podium. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said. "My name is Marcia Torres. I'm an attorney with the Oregon Elder Rights Center, and today we're going to talk about financial exploitation and how it often starts where we least expect it." Her voice was calm but carried a weight that made everyone listen. Behind her, a projector screen lit up with a slide that read, "Elder Financial Abuse, What It Looks Like." She clicked the remote and a list appeared. Unauthorized withdrawals, pressure to sign documents, Misuse of power of attorney. My stomach tightened at the last line. I crossed my hands in my lap as Marcia continued. In many cases, she said, these documents are presented by people the victim knows and trusts. Family members, caregivers, financial advisors. They often frame it as protection, but in reality, it transfers control. She clicked again and an image filled the screen. A sample form titled Durable Power of Attorney. The formatting, the wording, even the line for the notary looked identical to the one Dylan had slid across my counter days ago. My fingers curled slightly around my pen. Marcia went on explaining how to identify red flags, what steps to take, which agencies to contact. I barely heard her. My mind replayed the sound of Sabrina's voice telling me it was just for safety, and Dylan's smooth tone calling it standard procedure. After the presentation ended, the women clapped softly. Elaine leaned toward me. You see what I mean now, she said. I nodded. That was the exact form they brought me. Her eyes sharpened. You still have pieces of it. I shredded it, but I took photos first. Old habits die hard. Elaine grinned. You're smarter than most of them give you credit for. People began gathering around Marcia with questions, so we waited near the back until the room thinned out. Elaine waved to someone by the door, a tall man in a gray suit who looked too young to be comfortable in a room full of retirees. He held a folder tucked under his arm and had that focused look of someone used to sorting lies from facts. Linda, meet Detective Owen Price, she said. He works with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. He's helped a few women here before. He shook my hand. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Carver. Elaine tells me you've had some trouble recently. I took a breath. I wouldn't call it trouble yet, but I think it's headed there. He nodded, patient, waiting. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened the photo gallery, showing him the images of the power of attorney papers. I also had an audio file saved, the one from the kitchen the day Dylan tried to make me sign. I played it. Dylan's voice filled the air, smooth and false, talking about safety and convenience. Then mine calm but cutting, telling him I could read numbers faster than lies. Owen listened without interrupting. When it ended, he exhaled slowly. That's clear enough, he said. Do you want to file an official report? I hesitated, watching the dust float in the sunlight between us. My heart felt heavy, not from fear, but from the realization of what I was about to do. They're my family, I said quietly. He nodded. I understand. But so were the people in half the cases I work on. I looked down at my hands, the veins standing out against the skin. Edward used to say that honesty wasn't about loyalty. It was about what you were willing to stand for when it cost you something. I met Owen's eyes. What happens if I move forward? We start by documenting the incident, he said. I'll forward this to our Elder Abuse Task Force and coordinate with the Oregon Department of Justice. We can also issue a protective order to make sure they can't access your finances or approach you for signatures. He paused. But you need to be certain, Mrs. Carver. It's not easy to draw a line that sharp between you and your son's household. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick. I thought of Ryan's face that day, the guilt and confusion tangled together. I thought of Sabrina's words, her disdain wrapped in concern. I thought of how I had lived too long, keeping quiet for the sake of peace that never came. I lifted my chin. I'm certain. Owen gave a small nod, his expression steady. Then let's make it official. He pulled a few forms from his folder and placed them on the table beside me. The pages were dense with text, but I didn't need to read every line. I knew what they meant. He pointed to the signature line. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name, but the ink came out smooth and dark. I didn't stop until the last letter was done. When I slid the paper back to him, he smiled faintly. You did the right thing. Self-protection doesn't make you bitter, Mrs. Carver. It makes you free. I felt a strange calm settle over me then, like the air right after a storm when everything smells of renewal. Elaine placed a hand on my shoulder. Proud of you, she said. I managed a small smile. After all these years, signing for everyone else mortgages, tuition checks, insurance forms, I finally signed something that was mine. Owen gathered the papers and tucked them back into his folder. We'll be in touch soon, he said. And don't hesitate to call if they reach out again. Thank you, Detective. He shook my hand once more, then left the room, his steps firm and even. The sound of the door closing echoed softly against the walls. Elaine walked with me outside. The sun was dipping low, painting the parking lot in gold. The breeze carried the faint scent of cut grass and rain-soaked pavement. You all right, she asked. I nodded, lighter than I've felt in years. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. Then I turned toward my car, my purse heavier with the copies of the report, but my chest strangely light. As I started the engine, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked tired, but there was something new in them, a steadiness I hadn't seen before. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't signing for love or duty or obligation. I had signed for myself, and that I thought as I pulled onto the quiet street was the truest kind of balance I had ever written into my life. The rain came hard that night, beating against the roof like it was trying to get in. I had been reading by the fireplace, but the sound made it impossible to focus. I set the book down and went to the window. The yard was a blur of silver under the porch light, the rose bushes bending low beneath the storm. Then the motion sensor camera by the front door blinked to life. I glanced at the monitor on the kitchen counter and froze. Orion was standing on the porch, soaked to the bone, clutching a bouquet of wet flowers. His shoulders sagged and his eyes looked red, whether from rain or regret I couldn't tell. He stared at the door for a long time before finally speaking, his voice barely audible over the downpour. "Mom, please, I just want to talk." Behind him, the headlights of a car cut through the rain. Sabrina sat in the driver's seat, shouting something I couldn't make out until she lowered the window. The words were sharp and ugly. "She'll regret this." Ryan turned toward her, said something I couldn't hear, then looked back at the house. I stood behind the curtain, my heart pounding, but my hands didn't move. I couldn't open the door. Not tonight. He stayed there another minute, then dropped the flowers on the step. The bouquet landed awkwardly, petals scattering across the porch. The car lights flashed once, then the sound of the engine faded down the street. I stood there until the rain slowed, watching the flowers darken against the wood. The house felt colder than before, but quiet too, like it was holding its breath with me. By morning, the storm had passed. The air smelled clean, the kind of freshness that makes everything else look out of place. I stepped outside with my coat pulled tight. The sight stopped me mid-step. The fence along the side yard was bent inward. One post cracked near the base. The rose bushes I had trimmed only days earlier were crushed into the mud, their stems twisted and broken. My throat tightened as I knelt to pick up a single bloom, its petals torn. Elaine saw me from across her yard and hurried over. "Oh, Linda, what happened here? I think someone came back after the rain stopped," I said quietly. She frowned, scanning the damage. "You should report this. It's harassment, plain and simple." I nodded slowly. I already knew who would come. Later that morning, Detective Owen Price pulled up in an unmarked sedan. He walked the perimeter with quiet precision, his shoes leaving faint impressions in the soft ground. He examined the fence, took photos of the crushed flowers, and checked the door camera footage. When he played back the recording, Ryan's figure appeared again, standing in the rain. Owen didn't say much at first. When Sabrina's voice came through the speakers shouting from the car, his jaw tightened slightly. He turned to me. "Did they contact you after this? No, just the visit?" He nodded. "I'll file this under property damage and potential intimidation. It's not unusual when families feel cornered." I looked at the screen, at my son's face, frozen mid-frame. He looked so young in that moment, smaller than I remembered. I swallowed hard. "I don't want him arrested," I said. "Not yet." Owen gave a small nod. "Understood. We'll document it, that's all." He paused before adding, "You did the right thing calling." After he left, I swept the porch, gathering what was left of the flowers into a small pile. The petals had turned almost black from the rain. I threw them away, trying not to think about how soft they felt in my hands. By afternoon, a new envelope appeared in my mailbox. The letterhead read, "Riverbend Homeowners Association." I opened it on the porch, the damp wind fluttering the pages. "Dear Mrs. Carver, it has come to our attention that your recent landscaping activity has altered the uniform appearance of our community. Please be advised that further unauthorized changes may result in a fine. It was signed by Carolyn Marks, HOA president." I felt a small, bitter laugh escape my throat. Landscaping activity. That was what she called me, cutting the roses I planted on land I owned after they were trampled by the people who erased me from their family. Elaine was in her driveway again when she saw the paper in my hand. "What now? HOA warning," I said. "Apparently my yard offends their sense of order." She frowned. "Caroline Marks. She's close to Sabrina's aunt, if I remember right." That made me pause. Of course, it wasn't coincidence. "You think she asked Caroline to make things difficult for me?" Elaine shrugged. "I wouldn't put it past her. But you don't have to take it lying down. Bring that video to the next HOA meeting. Let them see what really happened." I looked at the letter again, the words blurring slightly in the light. I had spent most of my life avoiding scenes, keeping peace at any cost. But peace bought with silence wasn't peace at all. 2 days later, I walked into the HOA meeting with my laptop under my arm. The community room was half full, a few familiar faces scattered among rows of folding chairs. Caroline sat at the head of the table, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent light. When she saw me, her smile tightened. "Mrs. Carver, I didn't realize you'd be attending." I set the letter on the table in front of her. I thought it was only fair to address this in person. She straightened in her seat. "Our concern is simply maintaining consistency in neighborhood appearance." I connected my laptop to the small projector and hit play. The video flickered to life on the wall, showing Ryan standing in the rain, Sabrina shouting from the car, and the crushed fence the next morning. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the speakers. When it ended, I looked at Caroline. "The roses you mentioned weren't a violation of policy. They were evidence." I opened another window on the screen, scrolling to a highlighted line from the HOA handbook, Section 7.2. Homeowners are permitted to modify landscaping within their own property boundaries. The silence stretched. Caroline's face paled slightly. I could almost hear the whisper of paper as she shuffled the documents in front of her. I believe she started that perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. A few of the neighbors exchanged looks. Someone in the back coughed to hide a chuckle. Elaine sat 2 rows behind me, her expression proud and steady. I closed my laptop. No misunderstanding, just correction. The chair legs scraped the floor as I stood. The air felt lighter, as if the room itself had exhaled. Caroline cleared her throat. "I'll review the letter," she said. "Consider it withdrawn." As I walked toward the exit, someone murmured quietly, "Good for her." Then another voice, soft but certain, echoed it. Outside, the rain had started again, just a drizzle this time, more gentle than before. I stood under the awning, breathing it in. The wind carried the smell of wet roses from the broken bush. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I just needed to be right. The week after the HOA meeting passed quietly, the rain came and went, the kind of steady drizzle that softened everything it touched. I spent most mornings tending to what was left of the rose bushes, trimming away the broken stems until new buds began to show. The house felt calmer, almost at peace. One afternoon, Elaine stopped by carrying a small wooden box. She held it like something fragile. "I found this while cleaning out my attic," she said, handing it to me. "It has your name on the bottom." I brushed the dust away and saw the faint engraving, LC. The box was one Edward had carved himself during the first winter we moved into River Bend. I had forgotten it even existed. The wood smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Inside was a folded letter and an old cassette tape labeled in Edward's handwriting, just 3 words, "For when it's quiet." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. The ink had faded to brown, the handwriting uneven, but unmistakably his. "If they ever make you doubt your worth, remember you are the foundation they are all standing on. Don't let anyone tell you you're less than what you built." I pressed the paper to my chest, the edges rough against my skin. Elaine sat across from me, watching in silence. "Do you want me to stay while you play it?" she asked gently. "No, I think I need to do this alone." After she left, I found the old cassette player tucked in the back of the closet. The batteries still worked miraculously. I slid the tape in and pressed play. For a moment there was only static. Then his voice filled the room, softer than I remembered, but steady. "Linda, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't get to finish saying what I needed to. I know you'll carry on because that's what you do, but don't forget that you built everything they depend on. The home, the patience, the strength. If they make you feel small, remind yourself you are the reason they can stand tall." The tape clicked at the end, leaving only the hum of the player. I sat there, hands covering my face, and let the sound of him linger in the silence. The grief wasn't sharp anymore, just deep and familiar, like the echo of something that never fully leaves you. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too full of words that had nowhere to go. Around midnight I turned on my laptop and opened the community page for Evergreen Circle. The cursor blinked against the empty text box. I began typing without thinking. The title came first, "Stop Signing Blindly." The words poured out faster than I expected. I wrote about the pressure to trust family over instinct, about how easily kindness becomes currency. I described the forms, the manipulation, the quiet fear that comes when people you love treat you like an obstacle. I didn't mention names. I didn't need to. It wasn't about revenge. It was about warning. By the time I finished, the sky outside had begun to pale. I reread the piece once, then hit publish. The click of the mouse sounded louder than it should have. When I woke later that morning, my phone was full of notifications. Dozens of comments, then hundreds. Women from all over Oregon, then other states writing their own stories. A retired teacher in Idaho, a widow in Kansas, a nurse from right here in Portland. You said what I couldn't. Thank you for putting this into words. It's not just me. By the end of the week, the post had been shared thousands of times. The local paper, Portland Senior Voices, reached out for permission to reprint it in their next issue. They called it an essay about financial dignity and the courage to say no. Elaine stopped by with 2 coffees and an astonished smile. You're famous now, she said, handing me one. Fame isn't the goal, I said. I just wanted people to know they weren't alone. Well, they know now. The same afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, Notice of Defamation. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Dear Mrs. Carver, your recent publication contains false and defamatory insinuations regarding my client, Mrs. Sabrina Moore. If you do not retract the article within 48 hours, we will proceed with legal action. It was signed by a law firm in Salem. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat steady but firm. There was no signature from Sabrina herself, but the tone was hers, cold, calculated. I forwarded the email to Elaine, who called within minutes. Don't panic, she said. I've seen this tactic before. It's intimidation. Did you keep the metadata from the post? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yes, every timestamp, every file log. Good. Save the email headers too. It'll show her lawyer sent it from a public Wi-Fi. They don't have a case. Later that night, I sat in the dark, the laptop screen casting pale light across the room. The cursor blinked over the email as I archived it. I wasn't angry, not anymore. The attempt felt almost predictable. Outside, the rain started again, soft against the windows. I leaned back in the chair, feeling a strange calm settle in. I had lived enough years being quiet to know the cost of silence. The cursor still blinked, patient, waiting for me to type something back. Instead, I closed the laptop gently. My reflection lingered on the black screen, calm, unafraid. I didn't write that piece for her or even for Ryan. I wrote it for every woman who had ever been told that trust mattered more than truth. The house was quiet except for the rain and the slow rhythm of my breathing. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness fill the room. I wasn't looking for justice tonight or apology. I had found something better. My voice. The year turned quietly the way winter often does in Portland. The days felt shorter and the air carried that faint metallic cold that seeps through even the thickest coats. I had stopped checking the news after the essay went public, but one morning my phone rang with a familiar voice on the other end. Mrs. Carver, this is Detective Owen Price. Do you have a moment? My stomach tightened at the tone of his voice. Always calm, always deliberate, but today there was a different weight behind it. Of course, I said, setting my cup of tea down. He cleared his throat. The Bureau finished its audit on Northbridge Realty. It's official. Dylan Moore and Sabrina Moore are under investigation for using your Social Security number to launder funds through their company. I said nothing at first. The words took a moment to reach me. It was like hearing the ending of a story you already suspected but didn't want confirmed. They used my number, I repeated quietly. Owen continued. Yes, we traced multiple filings under your name. False tax claims, wire transfers, even a mortgage refinance tied to an offshore account. The IRS is opening a joint case with us. We'll need your statement again and possibly your appearance at the hearing. I took a slow breath. If you need me, I'll be there. Thank you. And Linda, he added, you did the right thing from the beginning. Not everyone has the strength to follow through. After he hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam rising from my tea until it disappeared. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought of Sabrina's sharp smile, Dylan's slick confidence, and the way Ryan's eyes had looked the night he stood in the rain. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was theft of identity, the taking of a name I had spent my whole life building. A week later, I received a notice from the HOA. They were holding one final hearing to address Caroline Marks's previous misconduct. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go, but Elaine insisted. Closure, she said, isn't about revenge. It's about making the record clean. The meeting room was smaller this time, more tense. Caroline sat at the front with her clipboard and forced smile. The board read a short statement acknowledging that their previous warning letter had been based on false information. When they called my name, I stood steadying my hands on the chair before speaking. "I'm not here for apologies," I said. "I just want the same respect everyone else gets." The room was quiet. Caroline's voice wavered slightly. "Mrs. Carver, we regret the misunderstanding. I'll be sending a written apology to accompany this record." I nodded once. That's all I needed. As I turned to leave, a few of my neighbors offered polite smiles. One even whispered, "Good for you." Outside, the wind carried a hint of spring, though the air was still cold enough to bite. The following week, Owen called again. "Ryan has been questioned," he said. "He's cooperating." My throat tightened. What did he say? He admitted that Sabrina and Dylan had pressured him into signing documents he didn't fully understand. They used his access to your old joint account as a cover for their transfers. He claims he didn't know it involved your social security number until now. I pressed my fingers against my forehead, feeling the pulse there. "He's telling the truth," I said quietly. "He was foolish, not malicious. That's the sense we got, too," Owen said. "He'll testify in exchange for leniency. It'll help the case move faster." The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, statements, and document requests. I signed more papers in a week than I had in years, but each one felt lighter than the last. There was something cleansing about putting everything in order, about knowing the truth would finally be recorded where it couldn't be erased. One morning, after another long call with the IRS investigator, I received a text from Ryan. It was the first message from him in months. "Can we meet? Just to talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, where he suggested the small cafe by the river, the one Edward and I used to go to on Sunday mornings. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting by the window. He looked thinner, older, the kind of tired that no amount of sleep fixes. He stood when he saw me, but hesitated before speaking. "Mom, I'm so sorry." I sat down across from him. He slid a plain envelope across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter and a folded receipt. "It's a cashier's check," he said quietly. $78,000, every cent you gave me. Sabrina transferred most of it back before they froze her accounts. The rest I took from my savings. I looked at him, unsure whether to feel sorrow or relief. "You didn't have to," I said. "I did," he said. "I let them pull me too far. I kept thinking I could fix it before it got worse. I didn't know how deep it went until it was too late." I studied his face, the same boy who once brought me wildflowers from the yard. "You can't undo what's been done, Ryan. But you can learn from it." He nodded, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't erase guilt," I said. "But taking responsibility is the first step toward growing up." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the low hum of the espresso machine. The waitress brought our coffee, and I watched the steam curl between us like a fragile bridge. He looked up. "What happens to them now?" Before I could answer, the TV mounted above the counter caught my attention. The local news was running a segment on federal indictments. The anchor's voice was calm, detached, but the images told the story. Dylan Moore and Sabrina Moore, both handcuffed, being led out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen: Northbridge Realty executives charged with fraud and identity theft. Ryan turned to look, his face pale. He exhaled a sound that was half relief, half grief. I watched the screen a moment longer, then looked back at him. "Justice doesn't need to shout," I said quietly. "It just needs someone to stand long enough for it to arrive." He nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mom." When I left the cafe, the river was calm, glinting under a thin winter sun. I stood for a moment by the railing, the cold air biting at my cheeks, and let the sound of the water steady my breath. The world kept moving the same as it always had, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was drowning in it. Some truths don't roar when they come. They just settle quietly, like balance restored to a ledger long overdue. Spring sunlight poured through the windows of my new apartment overlooking the Willamette. The air smelled of rain and roses. I watered the small rose bush on the sill, its petals trembling in the light. It felt good to start over somewhere quiet. A knock sounded. Elaine came in with 2 coffees and a handful of roses. "First blooms of the season," she said. I smiled and placed them in a jar. The place felt warmer instantly. "So how's life after Riverbend?" she asked. "Peaceful," I said. "Finally." She handed me an envelope. This was in my mailbox by mistake. From Ryan. My hands hesitated before opening it. His handwriting was careful. "Mom, I'm starting over. Thank you for teaching me responsibility instead of resentment. Love, Ryan." I folded the letter and felt a quiet relief settle in. He was trying, and that was enough. I went to my desk and opened the old accounting book I once used to track every dollar I sent him. At the top of the page, it still read, Carver Family Account. I drew a single line through the words, then wrote beneath it, Linda's new chapter. Elaine smiled. Keeping score again. Not score, I said. Just record. She laughed softly. Same thing, really. After she left, I sat by the window, watching the afternoon light shimmer on the river. The roses swayed gently, catching the breeze. I thought about that wedding invitation with no name, how it had once felt like erasure. But names don't disappear. They wait until we write them again. I touched one of the blooms, its color deep and alive. Outside, the wind carried the scent of spring. I wasn't the woman left off the card anymore. I was simply Linda, standing in her own story, watching something new begin to grow.